having. So your votes are going to decide the holder of this office. It's one of the most important votes that you'll cast. And certainly that is true for this moment in time for this election. So for that reason, I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to one of the candidates for this forum. I want to make clear how this is going to work. So I'm going to keep the discussion on track. The people who are moderating will send me messages if people have questions through the Zoom chat, and there'll also be sort of someone keeping track of time. And a couple of ground rules. We're going to start with an opening statement from Mike Schmidt. And I just want to make clear that we also invited Mike Schmidt's opponent in this race to participate. He chose not to do so. The fact that he's not here is in no way an endorsement of Mr. Schmidt. It's just the way this ended up taking place. But we're going to hear from Mike because he was willing to be here. Okay, so welcome to the forum, Mr. Schmidt. And we're really looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to give you, or the moderators will give you 3 minutes for your opening statement.
Great. Well, thanks for having me and giving us the opportunity to talk about these important issues. I'm running for District Attorney in Multnomah County because I believe that we're at a time in our nation's history where we need major reform now in our criminal justice system. I got my start as a high school teacher. I taught in the public schools of New Orleans, where I thought I was going to learn about our educational system, and I did, but I also learned a lot about our criminal justice system through my students' eyes. They were victims of crime, witnesses of crime, children of incarcerated parents, and sometimes defendants getting caught up in the system themselves and seeing the school to prison pipeline. One of my students, I recall, spending a weekend in solitary confinement. The charges were ultimately dropped, but the impact that had on his life at 14 years old and the rest of his school year was seriously felt. So I went to law school in 2005. I moved to Portland, Oregon from New Orleans right before Hurricane Katrina came through and studied criminal law and decided, I could get into the system and be the change that I wanted to see. Studied criminal law and got an internship at the local district attorney's office here in Portland and ended up getting a job there, working there until 2013. And while I felt like I was helping people, I didn't feel like I was changing the system. So I got out and since then I have worked at the legislature, but then for the most part, been the director of a state agency that works on statewide criminal justice reform work. Our statutory mandate is to improve the effectiveness, legitimacy, and the efficiency of our criminal justice system. So we've looked at things like collateral consequences of felony convictions for drug possession and changed the law. We've looked at how we can decrease our utilization of prison, yet still improve public safety. So we've looked at a lot of different issues. And when I saw the opportunity to run for district attorney and kind of marry that background experience of being a teacher, being a frontline prosecutor, and then being somebody who's looked at how we can improve a system and build networks and coalitions to get better outcomes in our foster care, educational, healthcare systems with criminal justice, I knew that this was the right opportunity. And so that's why I'm in the race.
So let's start by talking about the effect of the virus in jail and prison. These are facilities that are often crowded. They are not known for their great sanitary conditions. There are often real barriers for people on the inside and for staff in terms of being able to social distance and take the proper other steps to protect themselves. So there has been a kind of, I would say, uneven wave of movement around the country to try to make sure that people are leaving lockdown facilities if they don't need to be there, to try to stop them from coming into the criminal justice system if they're being arrested for something minor or nonviolent. Some jurisdictions are doing this much more than others. If you become the district attorney in the county, how will you take the pandemic into account in formulating criminal justice policy?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I've seen it's almost a bifurcated system, right? Because you have the local county criminal justice system, and then you have our state prison system. And at the local county system, I think our local officials are doing things very well. The sheriff, the district attorney, the county commission, they've come together. They've decreased our jail population by, I believe, 40% from where it usually sits. So they are taking this very seriously and trying to allow us to comply with social distancing. But then there's the disconnect, because at the state level, at the prison level, people are still getting sent to prison. People are not getting released. And so we're really starting to see that is a potential area for real problems in our communities. So if I win this race, I would become the district attorney on January 1st of 2021. And I think the issues that will be facing me, hopefully we're not seeing a resurgence and a continued spread of the disease, but that is getting tamped down. But we're going to have very serious issues with resources in our community that are no longer available. We're seeing budget cuts forecasts across all of our state agencies. Public safety is no different. And a glut of cases that are just amassing right now because we are not doing trials. We're not doing lower level cases. The next district attorney is going to have to figure out, how do you take what would be a normal workload and add to it an incredible backlog? I think that's going to be the first challenge that faces me. And there's no way to really do it, honestly. I'm going to need to engage community partners to see if there are things like restorative justice programs. Are there ways that we can still get the community members who may have been the victim of a crime accountability and healing, but at the same time be able to continue to run our criminal justice system? And so we're going to have to look at building new coalitions and new ways of doing business, and also looking at what has it meant to our community that we have been able to run a jail with 40% less population. Does that mean that we need to go back to the way things were? How was public safety impacted by that? I think there will be a lot of lessons for the next district attorney to look into, and I'm certainly going to be looking at those things. And then at the state level, continue to be an advocate for getting people out of our prison systems safely and with resources, so that we're hopefully not just putting them back in the community and spreading infection, because that's the big issue with a lot of our prisons. As the disease runs through those facilities, we need to safely bring people back into the community with the resources. And that's another challenge for our system. Housing, reentry services, those are serious challenges, and a tough budgetary time. That's going to be a problem as well.
So let me ask a couple of follow-up questions. Do you imagine, you're right to make the distinction between jails and prisons. And my sense as a reporter is that to date, most of the movement toward de-incarceration prompted by the virus has been in jails and not so much in prison. So if you were the district attorney, would you want to be looking at cases of people serving prison sentences to see who might be eligible for compassionate release? Or is this sort of something that you would initiate, as well as standing by and watching other parts of the system push for?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that we could look at in our prison system. People who have already served the majority of their sentence, people who are in for, certain types of crimes, nonviolent crimes, and only have 30 or 60 or even 6 months or 12 months left on their sentence. We've actually seen, unfortunately, that some people were eligible for treatment programs inside of our prisons, but those programs had to get shut down, and that had the impact of holding some people longer in prison than they otherwise would have been. So we need to, make sure that we're not holding people longer than we already would have, and look at those cases where we can get people out. I just saw a disturbing statistic, I guess, today posted that more people now have died of COVID in our prisons than have been executed in the last 10 years due to the death penalty. I mean, these are not people that were sentenced to death, yet they're dying in our prisons. I think that should concern all of us. And then, also, of course, looking at the people who are working in our facilities, going back to their families, and what hospital resources we would have if a local community gets overburdened like that. So there are a lot of considerations and a lot of good reasons why we should be thinking about how can we safely, decarcerate to allow as best we can social distancing. So I would definitely be an advocate for working with the governor to see if there are things we could do that way.
Um, the other follow-up I want to ask you about is about restorative justice, which seems like a real interest of yours, certainly is an interest of mine. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more specifically about which kind of offenses you see as potential um, gates, conduits for restorative justice, and then is there a way in which the necessity of dealing with the backlog creates a kind of opportunity to thinking of alternatives that to date restorative justice in a lot of systems is a kind of like extra like sprinkling around the edges of the system as well as opposed to being really integral to it. I wonder if there's a way that that balance could shift in the wake of the pandemic.
I think there is going to be an absolute necessity. I'm very proud to have the support of many community groups in Multnomah County. Groups that work with immigrant populations, groups that work with minority populations that have been disparately impacted by the criminal justice system. And I've had this conversation. Can we build something that there's still accountability for somebody who's breaking the law, there's still healing and taking care of somebody who's been victimized by another person, but is there a way that we can achieve that by utilizing community and community groups? And so those are very early conversations, but there's a lot of excitement and interest in thinking about, can we do this in a way where we still have, the victim at the center being focused on, we get the healing, we get the accountability, but we don't have to go through the traditional criminal justice system. I envision right out of the gate, that would be probably for what I'd consider, lower level property type crimes where people have suffered some sort of a loss. That would be immediately. And if people were willing to go through that type of an alternative process, that could be a good way for us to deal with a lot of cases in a backlog. Eventually, though, I've seen good evidence and research. I read Danielle Sered's book on restorative justice, Until We Reckon. It's an amazing book. It's really helped me in my thinking around this. And she talks about the amazing results that she gets for even violent crimes and things that, people might have traditionally shied away from. For me, at the end of the day, what's going to drive my approach as district attorney is I'm going to look at research, I'm going to look at the data, and if I can get better public safety results and higher satisfaction from victims who have been through the system, that's what's going to drive my decision making. And so I'm very interested in seeing some of the amazing results that she's been able to accomplish in her program and seeing if we can start piloting some things like that here as well.
Yeah, that is a really distinctive program because Danielle works exclusively with people who've been charged with violent crimes, only with the permission of the victims and their families. So it's an interesting model to be thinking about. So to turn to a different but related topic, lots of people in the criminal justice system have unstable housing or no housing at all, maybe struggling as well with mental illness. A recent study in Portland found that nearly 1 out of 2 arrests made by the city police in 2018 were of a homeless person, even though people without housing in Portland constitute less than 3% of the city's total population. Do you think this is the right approach? And if not, what specific steps would you be taking to ensure that people are not being criminalized for their lack of housing or because of poverty?
Yeah, it's absolutely not the right approach, and I think most people would tell you that we're clearly not solving the problem by arresting people at wildly disparate rates. The highest charged crime in Multnomah County is criminal trespass, which is essentially that. It's not being in a place that you're supposed to be in, and if you don't have a place to call home, just about every moment of your life could be trespassing. So we're not getting good results. And what ends up happening here is that you could get arrested for that, taken to jail, immediately released. And then we just start this cycle of catch and release, people failing to appear to court. And then eventually you might finally be held after 8 or 10 times of being picked up on a warrant. And then your case is just resolved with the credit for the time that you have served waiting for your case to be resolved. We're not solving any problems at all. We're just kind of exacerbating them and kicking them down the road. So there are some things that Portland is trying right now. We have a city commissioner, Joanne Hardesty, who's trying a Portland street response program, which would, instead of sending police out to certain, nonviolent type calls, that we'd send social workers. It's based off of a program in another county in this state that's had great results. And so I think looking for alternative programs outside the criminal justice system. We also have the LEAD program, which is a program based out of Seattle, stands for Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion, and is a similar idea that if you have contact with a police officer, that instead of just doing the traditional, okay, now I have to arrest you, now we're going to go to jail, they have the ability to call a navigator out to the scene right there. To work with somebody and saying, all right, let's get you into what do you need? Where are the resources? And the district attorney's office chooses not to prosecute those cases. So that program has not really been picked up as much as I think it could be or should be. But we need the resources fundamentally to have alternatives. And luckily, we have a initiative on our ballot to allow us raising funds for a wraparound homeless or services for people who are experiencing homelessness. And so that will be also crucial, especially in this time when we're expecting pretty tough economic times. But absolutely, I think what we've been doing isn't working. Everyone says and pays lip service that you can't arrest your way out of this problem. So it's time to actually stop trying to do it.
An investigation by the Oregonian last year found that mentally ill homeless people in Oregon are being charged with low-end crimes and spending extended periods of time incarcerated as a result. So this question relates to what you were just talking about. Are there specific things for people with mental illness challenges that you see as being things you can add or change to the current way of doing things?
Yeah, this is a particularly tricky problem for the criminal justice system, because what you have happening is you have somebody charged with a low-level crime that they would almost, usually receive, if they received any sentence or punishment at all, maybe it's a couple days in jail. So you can usually resolve those cases very, very quickly. It might even be a fine or community service. But if you are not mentally fit to stand for trial, then it puts the criminal justice system in an awkward position because you can't plea to wrap and resolve your case. So what ends up happening is you're held in jail. You're sent to the state hospital until you're treated to fitness. Then you're brought back to our jail so that you can actually resolve your case. And hopefully at that point you can. But at this point now, you've got somebody on a low-level crime that may have served weeks or even months, when somebody else charged with that crime would have maybe not served jail time at all. And so it's a really tricky problem. But I think the way you need to work on it is the state hospital is a very expensive resource, over $1,000 a day to send somebody to the state hospital. We need to work with them to see if we can get more money into our community to treat people until fit in a community setting, not in a custodial jail setting. And then we can start to work with them to resolve those cases. And hopefully in resolving those cases, our focus will be on how do we actually get at what is driving the underlying criminality, and not focus on, you must be punished for whatever disorderly conduct or something that brought you to the attention of the system in the first place. So we have mental health courts here in Multnomah County. But, quite frankly, this is a real challenge, and it's a lot of people that are caught up into the system this way. So yeah, it's just not fundamentally fair or right to hold somebody longer than you would hold anybody else just because they have a mental illness.
One of the most vulnerable populations during the pandemic is the immigrant community. Oregon is a sanctuary state, and yet the criminal legal system really impacts how immigrants who are undocumented interact with federal agents, with ICE, sent by the Trump administration. What, if any, is the district attorney's role in the enforcement of federal immigration laws?
Well, Oregon, proudly, we have a state statute that I believe has been on the books since 1987 that essentially says, look, we're not going to use state resources to do the job of federal agencies. And in fact, you're not allowed to use state resources to do that. So the role of the district attorney is to, first of all, abide by the law and to not use any agency resources to, cooperate or coordinate with ICE. And then second of all, ICE has been sending subpoenas out to law enforcement agencies. Some have complied with those subpoenas, even though they're not signed by a magistrate, and some are choosing to fight that in court. So the next district attorney can also make that choice. When they are requesting information, yes, we are bound to comply with the law. And if ordered by a judge to turn over information, we would have to do that. But we don't have to just take their word for it that they have the legal authority to do that. We can fight those things. And so far as I know, that legal issue has not been resolved in our jurisdiction. So I think it really is, just, and it's also important to be an outspoken person who lets people know that, look, if you come to the district attorney's office, we are not coordinating with ICE. You do not have to worry about if you are undocumented or if you have a family member that's undocumented. Because fundamentally, the reason that we are a sanctuary state and a sanctuary city is because we recognize that makes us more safe. And I say that because we want people to be able to report when they've been victims of crime. We want people to report crimes when they've been witnesses to crimes. We don't want people preying on our immigrant communities because they know that they are too scared to talk to police officers. So the district attorney also has a role, not to just kind of silently, obey the law, but to be vocal and try to make communities comfortable in knowing that they can work with our office and that we will not be cooperating with ICE to turn over information about their immigration status so that we can have a safer public safety system in our community.
Your platform calls for an end to cash bail. One thing I've learned in reporting on this issue is that it's easier to say no more cash bail than it is to figure out what is going to exist instead for making decisions about pretrial detention. What do you plan to do to make these detention decisions in your office if you're not going to be relying on money as the main tool for deciding who goes to jail before trial?
Yeah, fundamentally, I think there's a growing recognition that holding people in jail or in custody just because they're poor is not a fair criminal justice system. And letting some people out just because they have means is not a fair or publicly safe system. So this is an imperative. We need to get this done. It is tricky. In Oregon, we have an advantage that many states do not. We do not have a bail bonds industry in Oregon. And so that's good news for us because we're not facing an uphill battle with, well-financed lobbyists who will be going against this. We get to really have a conversation in Oregon about what is the right thing to do for public safety. So we've been working on this issue now for several years. I believe it also has been our system's constitutionality has been recently challenged in our court system. So that is also a pending threat to ending our cash bail system as it is. And so, I think we would try to learn from other jurisdictions that have worked on this. Obviously, if you can't use cash as a proxy for holding people, you need to empower judges to be able to hold people when they pose an immediate threat to public safety in your community. And then if people are released and they stop and they don't show up, eventually at some point you have to say, okay, we have to hold you to resolve this case. But those are really the only two reasons why people should be held in jail before their trial, if they're dangerous or if they never show up. Other than that, we should not be holding people. And, the research again shows that even holding somebody for a couple days completely destabilizes their livelihood, their jobs, their families, people that rely on them. And so, again, if our goal is to increase public safety, destabilizing families and communities is not going to help us achieve that. And especially when you see that it cuts against, racial minorities more than it does white folks, that's also a problem for fairness and a problem for disadvantaging communities even more. So there's so many reasons why we need to tackle this issue. And then as district attorney, I'll have policies at what I can and will not, when I will or will not request. And so I'll be looking at how we can limit that as much as possible. But we still have statutes on our books that are mandatory bail amounts. So we need statutory legal changes if we're going to change our system. So I'll be working with the legislature to do that.
And are the offenses that are covered by the statute and have mandatory bail, did they capture all the offenses that would be considered dangerous, or will your office also be making determinations about which, who is dangerous and how would you make those calls? Is that based on the offense that's being charged? Are there other factors that you take into account?
Yeah, we do have a preventative detention statute in Oregon that we can already use, where we essentially would put on evidence to the judge, to the court, of why we believe that this person presents an imminent danger. And so, some of the crimes that obviously, if you're looking at violent felony crimes, that is probably going to be something that we'll be thinking about. But even sometimes, lower level domestic violence crimes, there could be reasons for us to make an argument to a judge that for public safety, for victim safety, in that circumstance, a person should be held. So we're going to be looking at it case by case in terms of risk. It won't be solely determined based on, the crime. I think you have to look at if this person was to be released, is this going to happen again? Sometimes we see you can see like a bar fight or something like that, where you might be able to put some assurances in the community that, this person can't frequent bars or things that you could still do to make sure you're protecting public safety. So we'll look at it individually and make the determination whether or not there's an immediate threat to somebody being released. And if there is, then we should make that argument to the judge, and the judge should decide on whether or not the person should be held.
So the Multnomah County District Attorney, as you know, represents both the largest county and the most populous city in Oregon, which gives the office a lot of influence over policy in terms of sentencing and other aspects of criminal justice system, statewide policy. And what do you see generally as the role of the district attorney in influencing statewide policy? And what is your position on the controversial sentencing law, ballot measure 11 in Oregon, which is known as the One Strike You're Out initiative? Measure 11 establishes mandatory minimums for certain offenses. Your platform calls for measure 11 to be repealed. Can you talk about why you think that's important?
Yeah. So I think the district attorney, especially of Multnomah County, does have an obligation, and it is a part of their job to think about statewide criminal justice policy. As you mentioned, biggest county, biggest population center, most elected officials representing this area. So, and I think just by virtue of our size, we are a leader in what the policy should be. So I do see that as a big part of my job is to be an advocate for making our criminal justice system safer and based on research. Ballot measure 11, the reason that I'm opposed to ballot measure 11 is because essentially what it did is it shifted the power of who decides the sentence away from the judge and over to the prosecution. And the way that operates, and this is kind of an interesting, thing that most people don't realize. If I ask somebody in the community, who decides the sentence, people think it's the judge. Sometimes people think it's the jury, but the judge and the jury decide the sentence. Well, that's not true for mandatory sentencing. Who decides the sentence is what crime you're charged with. Because as soon as you're charged with a mandatory crime, the only person that can decide to charge you with anything else is the prosecutor. So you're either going to receive the mandatory sentence, or the prosecutor is going to change the charge and allow you to plead to something else so that you can get a different outcome. A judge can't help you. A judge cannot hear the case, hear all the facts and the witnesses of the jury, hear or in the trial, hear from the victim, and decide that, in this situation, the mandatory sentence doesn't apply. It's mandatory. So I think the reason that this is such a bad policy is it's taken what our system is supposed to be, this adversarial system where the prosecution makes their best arguments, the defense makes their best arguments, a court hears from a victim, and then the judge takes all of that information into consideration and decides based individually on what the sentence should be. This mandatory sentencing has completely broken that. And what we've seen since its passage in 1994, when the voters approved it, is that our prison population has more than tripled, I believe, since at that point. So it's used a lot of prison. So we could be doing things, better. You could not possibly talk about trying to cut our prison population in the state without addressing mandatory sentencing. So for me, we know that, the United States and Oregon is ranked like 24th and 25th in terms of incarceration rate in the country, and our country is by far an outlier for how much we incarcerate. So if we really want to do something different and try to use our resources differently than just for incarceration, it has to start with changing the system back to allowing judges to have the discretion to decide individual cases in front of them.
I wrote a whole book about the power of prosecutors. I've thought and talked a lot about what you just said. That was a very good, clear explanation of that dynamic.
Good,
I feel like that's like the one thing in the world I am qualified to pass judgment on. What if Measure 11 is not repealed, and then this power that you're describing continues to reside with the prosecutor, which would mean with your office? How would you approach charging decisions as a DA if you were trying to take on the role of reducing or mitigating these mandatory sentences?
Yeah, it really, in this way, it can bind the hand of the prosecutors too, because once you're charged with that crime, that is the mandatory sentence. So the only way to do something differently is to charge somebody with something else. So an attempt of that crime. So it still would be a challenge. The Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, I do a lot of state data, and I look at how we use prison across our state. They do a good job they're on the lower side of how much prison they use for these types of crimes. I would continue to look at that and how we can try to listen to victims and be in that position. But it's really going to be kind of case by case and looking at how can we make sure that we have all the right information and the relevant information to make good decisions, and then do we need to continue to advocate for as much prison as we otherwise would, or is there some other way that we can achieve a result differently? But it really is completely up to the prosecution.
Another point of controversy throughout the country is the death penalty. Do you think that the death penalty is an effective deterrent to crime and promoter of public safety? And as district attorney, would you seek death penalty sentences?
I would not seek the death penalty. I'd be the only district attorney in the state to say that. And it starts off exactly where your question was, which is it an effective deterrent to crime? And the research that I've seen shows that states that don't have the death penalty, which I believe is approaching half or so, they do not see higher murder rates. They are not any less safe than states that do have the death penalty. So no, I don't think that it's a deterrent. In Oregon, we have a moratorium on the death penalty and have had that for a decade or so at this point. We've only had 2 executions in the last 60 years or so. And so then when you look at it from that lens and then start to think about what a resource intensive prosecution seeking the death penalty is, I spoke with our former Chief Justice. He tells me he's done a lot of research in this area, that 60 to 70% of cases in Oregon that sought the death penalty will end up getting reversed on appeal at some point. So there's a huge error rate. So that drives up the cost of doing these things. That also brings the victims and their families back over and over again into the system. And all for a penalty that is not going to be imposed. So I think there's a lot of just efficiency cost arguments for why it fails us. But then I've also talked to victims' families who at one point may have thought that the death penalty was what they wanted. And look, not to say that all victims are against or for the death. I mean, there are a broad community who have a lot of different views on this, but many that I have talked to have said it did not give them the closure that they had hoped that it would, and are now actively against it. I talked to the superintendent of the prison who did preside over the only 2 executions that this state has had in the last 60 years. And he talked about the impact that that had on him and on his staff that had to actually kill somebody. That the state is, saying you have to put this person to death, and he's the person who had to take and carry that out. And what kind of a trauma that inflicted on him to have to do that with his staff. He's now adamantly opposed to the death penalty. So, if I'm looking at the pros and cons of the death penalty, the cons far outweigh, if there are any pros, which I'm not even convinced that there are. Then I look at national statistics about 1 in 9 people getting exonerated because we got it wrong. With true innocence, DNA, other things coming out and actually exculpating people. So we get it wrong frequently in this country, and then we also know that it cuts against minorities and people with diminished capacity more than other people. So I mean, there's just so many reasons why the death penalty is a bad policy. It doesn't keep us more safe. It's expensive. We could put that money towards actually helping victims deal with the trauma and not just keep bringing them back into the court system over and over again for appeals. So I would not seek the death penalty. I don't think it's a good policy. I think Oregon should have that conversation and we should try to get rid of it.
I have 3 questions from community members. The first one comes from Dr. Alicia Moreland Capuia. I hope I'm saying her name correctly. Apologies if not. Who's a physician, author, and expert in global health, trauma, addiction, and development and change of systems. She says, we're in a time of intense challenge in which trust in leadership and systems is eroding, especially where justice is concerned. There sometimes appears to be a kind of artificial conflict between science and culture. And this is relevant in the area of criminal justice reform, especially regarding our current understanding of brain science, development, and trauma. And thinking about how to apply that in an even-handed way to a system that serves youth and families in marginalized communities. So if you are selected as district attorney, what is your commitment to employing evidence-based, trauma-informed measures in your practices and leadership?
I think this is crucial. Again, for me, running for this office, one of the most important things in my job would be public safety. So if I can achieve better public safety by addressing trauma, being trauma informed with our victims, that they can get, the services they need, better closure, and we can pursue accountability that is more likely to make somebody be successful in the community, less likely to reoffend, decrease recidivism rates. Yeah, I'm going to do that every single time. I mean, that is really what is going to drive the way that I think about this. And as an example, district attorneys' offices across the country really frequently, when they look at their, how should they be measured in their success, it's measured in terms of how many cases they've processed, how many wins, how many losses that they have. That doesn't really tell you anything about how much public safety they are creating. I think the next district attorney needs to start thinking about new outcome measures that they could employ to judge not only their performance, but their staff's performance and who is achieving, who is seeking things that are going to improve our outcomes. One of the things I think we could do is look at recidivism rates by caseload. You could look at recidivism and see, did these sentences, when we sought these penalties, what kind of results did we end up achieving? And it's a complex ecosystem. I recognize that. But if the district attorney is being relied on to make sentencing recommendations, then that recommendation should be based on something, and it should be based on, hopefully, being somebody accountability, but then also creating more safety and less victims. I mean, that is what we're trying to accomplish. And so if you're not measuring those things, if you're not tracking that data, and you're not constantly analyzing your sentencing practices to see if you're achieving those results, then you have no idea. And we're just talking about how many cases we prosecuted and how many convictions that we got. So we need to evolve past that. Looking at things like brain science, especially for juveniles, absolutely crucial. We just had a major law change in this state that said that juveniles are no longer automatically tried in adult court for certain crimes. That was a good change. But if we're really going to be true to the brain science, we also have to recognize that the developmental, of adolescent brains, they're not fully formed at 18. And that's where right now our legal system is when you become an adult is when you're 18. So how can we incorporate the brain science that says that you're developing that all the way until about the age of 25? How do we bring that into the criminal justice system and thinking about, is there something that we should be doing different around that for that population? So, I think continuing to look at the science, the research, and then thinking and talking to experts like Dr. Kapuya about how could we think about doing things differently.
I just want to make the point that your insight about sentencing and evidence-based practices is actually a kind of unusual insight within the criminal justice system, in which there's actually very little tracking of different sentencing outcomes and the results they have in terms of whether people reoffend. So that will be something that if you succeed in really looking at that, a lot of researchers will be very interested in, I'm sure.
Yes.
Our second question comes from Carl McPherson, who's the executive director of Metropolitan Public Defender, which is the single largest provider of public defense services in Oregon. He is a longtime criminal defense attorney, and he asks a question that is crucial for the work of defense attorneys. Timely, complete, and open discovery is critically important to defense attorneys and our clients, Carl says. Too often, the disclosure of discovery is delayed or late. And what he's talking about here is really the evidence that the prosecution has, that the state has gathered, because the state, of course, controls the investigative apparatus of the police, and so usually has at its disposal the information that's really going to prove whether someone committed a crime or not. So when it's delayed or late, Carl says that really hinders the representation defense attorneys can provide. Will you commit to providing the defense with full and complete initial discovery at first appearance? This is a practice often called open discovery. And why or why not?
Yeah, and this is something that I would look forward to working with Carl on is making sure that they have everything that the district attorney's office has at that point. I recognize that sometimes investigations can be ongoing and things continue to evolve. That can happen. But what we have, they should absolutely have. And it really is not only just a fairness thing, but it's also an efficiency thing. As soon as Carl and his attorneys can have that information, the sooner that they can properly advise their client on, what they are looking at in terms of potential outcomes for their case. And so it's not only the right thing to do from a fairness standpoint, it's also in everybody's best interest that we can continue to get those cases moving through our system. That helps witnesses, that helps victims of crime, that helps everybody. And so I definitely look forward to working with Carl to make sure that they are getting everything that they need as soon as we have it. I know that digital discovery is something that I don't think has fully been implemented in this county. So I think that's something that we can look at to see if there's a way that we can kind of get more with the times and making sure that we can get things even faster. So there are things that we can improve upon, and I would look to Carl and his firm for feedback on how we're doing in achieving those goals.
The last question I have for you comes over Facebook from Madeline Barbara. She asks, what will you do to differentiate human trafficking from sex work in your office? What will you do to decriminalize sex work and protect sex workers from over-policing in Multnomah County?
Yeah, this is a challenging issue. Those two things are not the same at all, right? The sex work and trafficking are completely different things, but oftentimes people can get wrapped up into the same kind of conversation. So I think the hard thing is to really figure out who is who and what interventions we need. We know that criminalizing sex workers actually puts them in harm's way, can make them less safe, ends up making more victims in our community. By driving, those practices underground. So we need to make sure that that's not happening. And then for people who are being trafficked, we need to actually get resources to them to try to get them out of that life. But I've talked to people who are experts in sex trafficking in this county, and one of the pernicious things about it is sometimes people who are being trafficked don't necessarily always see themselves as being trafficked. And so it can kind of turn into, in some ways, almost a domestically violent relationship where you're fighting against that. So how do we get people the resources that they need to be able to break out of that system? And I think we should also recognize that traffickers. I have this, before I really learned a lot about it, vision of kind of a Hollywood movie of what trafficking looks like. Well, trafficking, according to local officials here, is actually a much more local situation. It's people who grew up here trafficking other people who grew up here, and they're frequently from similar communities, impoverished communities that are doing this to earn resources. So I think we need to look at how we're attacking the problem. It's not a Liam Neeson movie, sex trafficking. It really is also a community-based approach. And luckily, we have some experts here in Multnomah County that I think do a really good job. I'm not going to be, looking at prosecuting people who are prostituting consensual adult sex. That's not where I'm going to be putting my resources. But I am going to be obviously looking at on the trafficking side of things. People who are trafficking others, we have to break that cycle. So how we do it, and working with local experts who have been working on those issues, I'll use them to inform a lot of my practices.
It's time for you to give your closing statement. You have 3 minutes if you want to use them.
Great. Well, I've enjoyed the conversation, really appreciated it. This is a unique opportunity in Multnomah County's history. It has been over 4 decades since we've had a truly contested district attorney's race. So this community for the first time is having conversations that it really probably has never had. And so I've been so excited to be a part of that. And then to see how we've been embraced as a vision for what a criminal justice system could look like. I have a lot of support from elected officials, the governor, Congressman Earl Blumenauer, and the entire county commission. I've got law enforcement support from the sheriff, who recognizes that his jails should not be our largest homeless shelter and our largest drug and mental health facilities. And then from there, looking at community groups, labor. Proud to have the support of a lot of labor groups who are interested in racial justice for their members, and see how the working class gets caught up into our criminal justice system, and that destabilizes their ability to bring home means to support their families. And what can we be doing to actually prosecute people who prey on our working class? By looking at things like wage theft. So very proud to have the support of the vast majority of labor unions in this community. And then also community groups. And I think they're going to be crucial to not only, hopefully getting the victory here in the next less than a week, but also to having that ongoing relationship. Because as one of your questioners pointed out, the legitimacy of the criminal justice system has got to be at an all-time low. And we need to rebuild that trust, because without that trust, we're less safe than we could be. We need to make sure the criminal justice system is working for everybody, and that people feel like when their son or daughter goes for a jog in the streets, that they're safe and they don't have to worry about getting contacted by law enforcement. I mean, that's just unfortunately in our country not where we're at. And I think we need to do a good job locally to make sure that we're doing everything we can to assure communities that we're a partner and that we care about their health and safety. And so I look forward to working with those groups who have endorsed this vision of a race of how can we get more justice, fairness, and health, and focus on the right things that make us all more safe.
Thank you so much. This concludes our forum for the Multnomah County District Attorney race. A reminder, primary election day is on Tuesday, May 19th. If you're voting by mail, your ballot must be received, not postmarked, by May 19th. That is a crucial clause, which we are all going to be thinking more and more about as election season proceeds. Thank you so much to Mr. Schmidt and to everybody who joined us today. We really appreciate it.